This is the next installment in the village's ongoing investigation of a potential stormwater utility, and pick it back up with our village manager.
Yes, this is the third installment out of 4 regarding our consideration of a stormwater utility. And keeping in our tradition, I will invite David Hyder from MFSG, Municipal and Financial Services Group, to walk us through this presentation tonight.
Okay, thank you, Dave. Good evening, Mayor, Commissioners. I am happy to say that I'm not talking about liquor this evening.
Oh, you may want to be. That's right.
We might make this more interesting if we had some liquor while we were going through it. But what we're going to go through this evening is we're mainly going to talk about the stormwater fee analysis. We're going to focus in on looking at what the rate base, the fee structure, the credits, the actual stormwater fees, and then once we look at the actual stormwater fees, what the fee impact would be to property owners, and then we want to do some benchmarking and compare what others in the state of Illinois have done with stormwater utilities related to the fees. Just a reminder in terms of where we've been and where we're going. We've had 2 workshops already. Workshop 1 was a policy overview background. That occurred in early August. Our second workshop was in September 13th. We looked at the level of service and the magnitude of fee, really zeroing in on what it costs to provide the current level of service that you provide today, as well as our recommended level of service, what your revenues are in comparison to that currently. What we're going to focus on tonight, as I mentioned, is the stormwater fee analysis. And then our 4th workshop, which will be in 2 weeks, the 3rd meeting in October, will be our recommendations. So we're going to jump right into the stormwater fee analysis. And just to start it off, I want to mention what the goal of the stormwater fee is. And really the main goal is to equitably assess the cost of providing stormwater service to property owners based on their impact to the stormwater system. So the 2 key things there are that we want to equitably allocate those costs of providing the service to those that cause you to incur those costs or that have the impact on the stormwater system. And to meet that goal, we need to look at 2 items. We need to first look at what's our unit of measure for the fee, which we term the rate base, and then also how do you impose that fee? What's the structure that you'd use? So first off, zeroing in on the rate base, there's various rate bases that are used to develop stormwater fees. Some typical approaches would be to use impervious area of the property. You could use impervious area plus pervious area. You can use the total area of the property or intensity of development. There's some kind of off-the-wall ones. Water usage is sometimes used. But typically the basis for the rate base that's chosen is often dependent upon the availability of data. And the use of impervious area is by far the industry practice, the industry best practice, the most common approach, primarily because it's the impervious area that relates directly to the runoff and the demand on the system, or the impact that a property owner has on the stormwater system. Impervious area is easily measured and verified. We know how much pavement's on a property, how much roof space there is, sidewalks, things of that sort. It's been upheld in the courts numerous times in terms of a defensible base for a fee. And fortunately, impervious area is readily available for all parcels in the village. We have the impervious area for every single parcel in the village, and we know what it is. So we do have the data, so this would be the recommended approach would be to use impervious area. Some examples, here's a residential property in the village. You can see the aerial here. This is the impervious area on this residential property. So it's any impervious area, any area where water can't penetrate would be considered impervious. Another example here would be a non-residential large parking lot within the village. So it's all impervious. And another example, commercial property that has a parking lot as well as a big roof space, the impervious would be shown there. So looking at the big picture of impervious and the number of parcels that you have and how much impervious area you have by class within the village, you can look at these 2 pie charts. The pie chart on the left shows the number of parcels by class within the village, those that are tax exempt, those that are industrial, commercial, and residential. You can see residential make up almost 74% of the total parcels. Next largest would be commercial at 23%. Industrial is a small in terms of number of parcels, and then tax exempt. Now the important part is over to the right, which shows the actual impervious area measured for all of the parcels by each of these property classes. So as on the left, the largest number of parcels is residential, but they also make up the largest piece of impervious, but it's not nearly close to 74%, it's about 47%. Whereas and then commercial makes up about 36% of the impervious, industrial makes up about 8.4, and tax exempt makes up about 8.4. So that's the actual impervious area by each of these property classes within the village. Now if we zoom in a little bit further and look at the single-family residential properties, since this is the largest number of parcels that you have within the village, this is a distribution histogram of the number of properties and how much impervious area is on each of these properties. So it actually gives you a nice bell-shaped curve. You can see the largest number of properties have about 3,000 to 3,500 square feet of impervious. And then your distribution goes out from there. There's some properties that don't have any impervious that would be considered vacant. And then there's some at the other extreme that have a very significant, larger than 7,000 square feet of impervious. That's the distribution there. So rate base is what we propose using as the basis that defines the measure for the stormwater fee. And the rate structure defines really how that fee is imposed. So the two different types of classes that are typically represented within a stormwater fee would be single-family residential parcels. And there's a number of ways to structure the fee for those. You could go through and actually measure each parcel by parcel and have a different stormwater fee for every single-family residential property. You could take an average of all those properties, which would be about 3,300 square feet of impervious, and say we're going to charge everybody one equivalent runoff unit. That's a fairly common approach, so everybody would pay the same stormwater fee if you're single family. Or you could do a tiered ERU approach, which would be to take the averages within the distribution we looked at, and you could have small ERUs, medium ERUs, and large ERUs to give a little bit more equity in terms of the allocation based on impervious. And then those that are not single family are typically handled on a property by property basis, but measured as equivalents of residential ERUs. So I'll get into that in more detail, but our recommended approach and what we think warrants more examination is to use the tiered ERU approach within the village, as well as the parcel by parcel analysis for non-residential. We did go through this analysis with staff and went back and forth, and this was the approach that we think makes most sense. So if we zero in on that a little bit, again, here's the distribution for single-family residential impervious. And if we look at putting it into a small parcel, medium parcel, and a large parcel, this is what we think is a fair and equitable distribution. So that the small parcel would be any residential property that's single-family that has anywhere from 1 to 2,500 square feet of impervious. They would be considered 0.75 of an ERU. That class makes up about 13% of the total single-family residential. Then where the majority of your property owners fall in the single-family categories and the medium parcels, the 2,500 to 4,000 square feet, it's about 60% of them, they would be considered 1 ERU. And then large parcels would be above 4,000 square feet of impervious, up to 7,000. They would be considered 1.5 ERUs, and that makes up about 28%. Just had a thought jump into my mind. In terms of the ERUs, that's essentially, we'll get into it more, but that's the basis that's used for charge for the fee. So if you're 1 ERU, you'd pay a certain fee. If you're 0.75 of an ERU, you'd pay 0.75 of the fee. So that's really the basis there. So again, what that looks like for single-family residential. Again, you have a small, medium, large parcel. You can see the bounds that we've set on those for impervious. Again, they would be 0.75, 1 ERU, and 1.5 ERU. It should be noted that you could have a redevelopment take place that would turn a small parcel into a large parcel if you had an add-on or a redevelopment. So that's why we think it's important to have that distribution and not just use the average. We think that it provides more equity in that sense. So that's the single-family residential. Here's an example again of that same parcel. When we actually look at the measurements of impervious on this parcel, it's 3,500 square feet of impervious. So they would fall into the medium or 1 ERU. So they would be charged 1 ERU for their stormwater fee. Then as we move forward, I mentioned we would look at non-residential, all non-single-family residential parcels. And the approach there is to take the average single-family ERU, which is 3,300 square feet, and then to use multiples of that for every single non-residential property. So an example here would be to take a property that has 2,900 square feet of impervious, it's non-residential, you divide that by the 3,300 square feet, so this individual parcel would be 9 ERUs. So there is equity there. Each individual non-residential property would be measured. And typically you want to do that because there's a greater distribution of ERUs. You can have an extremely large commercial property and a very small commercial property, so it's more difficult to put them into the averages. And we'll look at that in a minute. So the way this would play out, again, with our example from before, this is a non-residential parcel, the parking lot. The total impervious area of that parking lot is 59,000 square feet. So using our approach would turn that parking lot into 18 ERUs. So they would pay 18 times the stormwater fee that we're going to present because of the area of their parcel. Another example here of the non-residential parcel, total impervious area of 32,500 square feet, which turns into 10 ERUs. So again, they would be charged 10 times the stormwater fee. So shifting gears a little bit, we need to talk about credits because that impacts the stormwater fee, because that's potential revenue that we wouldn't be collecting, that we would be reducing the fee by, and we need to factor that in before we talk about the fee. Essentially what a stormwater credit is it's a fee against it's a credit against the fee. That's a reduction on the property in return for on-site stormwater management. So the credit does recognize that the on-site stormwater management may reduce the village's stormwater expenditures. And ideally, the credits encourage property owners to proactively manage stormwater on their site. This is one of the key benefits of a credit program, and it's one of the key benefits of a stormwater utility and having a fee, is that we want to encourage people to do something about the stormwater on their property. And often a fee brings that to the forefront, and credits recognize that people are taking those steps. I could spend a half an hour talking about the various credit programs that we've developed and that are commonly put in place, but I have a high-level view here of a typical credit program. Typically, credits fall into 3 types of control activities. Those that would handle volume control, so the actual quantity of water coming off a property. Control activity that handles the quality of water coming off the property, so it may take out sediments and things like that. And then direct discharge. If there's a discharge of stormwater that doesn't go into the village system, it goes outside of the village limits, there's often a credit for that. So some examples of these control activities. For volume control, you can have detention basins, rainwater harvesting, such as rain barrels, green roofs, things of that sort. And the typical range of credits for those types of activities would be anywhere from 5 to 30% reduction on the stormwater fee. Water quality examples would be rain gardens, permeable pavement, best management practices, and again, typically about 5 to 30% reduction on the stormwater fee, depending upon the volume and the quality of control for the stormwater. And then direct discharge, the portion of the property that may discharge outside of the village, you again would get a credit for that. We would recommend, and what's very common, is that you do not have a credit program that would allow somebody to totally mitigate their fee. There's a fixed cost of providing the stormwater throughout the village that everybody benefits from. There may be a rain event where normally you can handle all the stormwater, but we still need to be ready to receive it. So typically you'd set the maximum credit limit at 50%. A little bit of administration, typically you'd have a credit application be required, as well as an application fee, so this is taken seriously. The fees typically range anywhere from $100 to $200. And so if you think about it from a perspective of, depending on how high the fee is, it may not make sense for somebody to actually apply for the credit. And the reason is to keep the administration down. We do want these to be serious, on-site mitigation that really does reduce the volume and increase the quality of the stormwater. So you do want it to be taken seriously, and that's typically the reason for that level of fee. Some control activities, some examples here. You have a rain garden up on the left in a residential area, some pervious pavement, green roof, and then some best management practices within a parking lot. So there's some typical examples just to put some pictures with the words. Okay, so we've established the level of service last time. We looked at the expenditures. And now we've just talked about the fact that we may reduce the revenues by offering some credits. So to get our total revenue requirements, and this is the calculation of the fee, we need to add together the level of service and the reduction in revenues. Once we've defined that, we would divide by our rate base, or our billable units, which we've talked about, and that ultimately gives us the stormwater fee. So I'm going to go through real quick, again, our total revenue requirement. This is the level of service from last time. The expenditures that were identified, your current revenues at $2.5 million. The current stated level of service in fiscal year 13 would be about $3.4 million, 3.3, and then the recommended level of service was $5.7 million. Based upon the estimated reduction in revenues, you can see the range that we estimate that you would essentially be giving up in reduction in the fee. So that gives us, we need to add that in. That gives us our total revenue requirement, $2.6, $3.5, and $6 million for each of the levels of service. So now we're at a point where we can actually calculate the fee. We've identified, again, the current, if we were just going to replace the current revenues, it'd be $2.6 million factoring in the credits. So applying that structure that I talked about with a single-family residential where you'd have a small parcel, medium, and large, the fee would be $480, and this is per month, $640, and $960, and that's the 0.75, the 1 ERU, and the 1.5 ERU. And then a non-residential would be charged based on a per ERU basis of impervious that they have. So the 1 ERU times 10 if you're 10 ERUs. Next level of service, to meet the current stated level of service at the 3.5, you can see the fee would be $640, $850, $1280, and then $850 again for a non-residential on a per ERU basis. And lastly, at the recommended level of service, obviously the fee is higher, the 1080, 1440, 2160, and then 1440 for all non-residential. So that's what the fee looks like to meet each of those levels of service. In terms of the revenue collection disallocation, we wanted to remind you again of what we looked at last time in terms of where you currently collect your revenues. So the pie chart on the left represents where your current revenues for stormwater come from. Since it's on assessed value and property tax basis, about 76% of your revenues for stormwater come from residential customers. About 21% come from commercial, about 3% from industrial, and then because they're tax exempt, they don't pay any property taxes, tax exempt don't contribute currently. If we move to the stormwater fee revenue allocation, which looks at impervious, you can see that the distribution shifts fairly dramatically. But this one slide is, really the crux and the culmination of all of the discussions in terms of the reason why you would potentially go to a stormwater fee. Because if you remember, our goal is to equitably assess those costs based upon the impact that people have on the stormwater system. And if I have more impervious, I'm impacting the stormwater system more, and that's what the stormwater fee does. So the tax exempt that currently don't pay anything, they are certainly having an impact on your stormwater system. And under the stormwater fee approach, the equitable allocation would be shown there in the pie to the right. That's a very important concept to understand. Want to move now and show you what the impact to the property owners would be. So we have some examples. First, at the current revenues, if we're just replacing the current revenues, obviously the residential single family would pay based on the small, medium, and large, what I showed earlier. The average church, which would be considered a tax exempt, has about 18 ERUs. So they would pay about $115 per month towards stormwater. The large hospital in the village is 235 ERUs. They'd pay $752. And the university, which has 278 ERUs, would pay close to $900. Based on the on-site mitigation, both at the hospital and the university, we estimate that they would both receive close to the maximum credit of 50%, so that we have factored that in. If we look at the current stated level of service, we're looking at the higher fees. So the church goes to $153, hospital goes to about $1,000, then you're looking at about $1,200 for the university. And then finally, at the recommended level of service, you can see that the monthly bills are obviously higher, about $260, $1,700, and about $2,000 for the university. So we wanted to move it even a little bit further and try to address, I think this was one of the issues that was brought up last time, is and try to do a comparison of how revenues are collected today. Because I wanted to reemphasize that I mentioned last time that the stormwater fee is not the reason for these costs. I'm sorry, the stormwater utility is not the reason for these costs and these enhanced levels, recommended levels of service, but rather they're coming at you and you have to fund them one way or another. A stormwater fee and a stormwater utility is just one way to do that. You could keep your current approach and fund it with property taxes. But it's important to note that it's not because we're considering the stormwater utility that these increased costs or these increased funding levels are being examined. You're going to have to address them. You're on a 220-year replacement cycle of your stormwater mains right now, and that's not sustainable. So the funding needs to be there. So let me take you through this. What this shows is for the average residential property, which would be 1 ERU, again, their monthly stormwater fee, $640 under the current revenues, $850 under the stated level of service, and then recommended level of service, $1440. Now, if we attempt to collect the stormwater costs through the property tax, as you currently do, and we assume that the average single-family home is a $300,000 assessed value, this is what they would pay under the current approach. So to meet your current stated level of service on a monthly basis, a single-family residential with a $300,000 assessed value would pay $1,232. Under the recommended, they'd pay $2,081. And you can see the difference there between the stormwater fee and the property tax. We also did the exact same thing looking at some commercial properties. So this is at 2000 Butterfield Road. The assessed value of this property is $7.7 million. What they would pay based on the stormwater fee, since they are 139 ERUs, would be $890 under the current revenues. To meet the current stated level of service, it would be about $1,200 and about $2,000 at the recommended level of service. Unfortunately, this property doesn't have any stormwater mitigation on its site, so they would not be eligible for the credit. Based on the current approach of assessed value, you can see that what they would pay if we tried to continue to collect it through the property tax fee, through the property tax, and you can see the difference there. We then did the same thing with a commercial example at 1245 through 9 at Ogden Avenue. Their assessed value is about $500,000. They're 7 ERUs. They would pay more under the stormwater fee. And then lastly, property at 1212 75 Street, commercial example. They're 120 ERUs. They would also pay more under the stormwater fee. It should be mentioned, though, that these are the 3 examples that we have. If you're a commercial property that doesn't have a lot of impervious, such as a several-story building that has little impervious but a high assessed value, you actually would see a reduction in your stormwater, your contribution to stormwater. So those with high assessed values, little low impervious, there would be a shift there. So I don't want it to make it look like all commercial are going to pay more. There are some, depending on how the assessed value works out, that would pay less. And lastly, we're going to talk about some benchmarking, just give you some examples of how other utilities in the state of Illinois that have stormwater utilities have structured their fee structures. So you can see the localities. The vast majority, in terms of their rate base, use impervious area. There's a few. Freeport does a flat fee by property type. So if you're commercial, it's one fee. If you're industrial, it's another fee. It's just it's not tied to the actual area of the property. Rock Island does gross area, and Tinley Park actually uses water use. In terms of the fee structure, you can see it's a blend of some use a flat fee per parcel or an average ERU. Some do the tiered ERU approach that we're recommending. And then for non-residential, it's most typically done on a multiple of ERU, as we're recommending that each property is looked at, the impervious, and then it's treated as a multiple of the ERUs. So what we're recommending is within the norm to use impervious, to use a tiered approach for residential, and to use a multiple of ERUs for non-residential. And then lastly, wanted to talk a little bit about exemptions and credits. All of the utilities that have stormwater fees in the state of Illinois don't exempt any property class, so they don't exempt tax exempt or any other property class. Everybody pays the fee in all these localities, and you can see that some offer credits and some don't. Those that do offer credits, it's typically, as I mentioned, based on the quantity of runoff, the water quality, and then whether it's direct discharge. Lastly, where the fees fall out, as I mentioned, I think this is in the first workshop, there are some utilities, about 7 of the total, that use a stormwater fee as well as other revenue sources. So those that are blue here use both a stormwater fee as well as property taxes or other revenue streams to fund their utility. They're not fully self-supporting. Those that are red do fund their utility with a stormwater fee. And you can see the monthly fee for an average single-family home and how the distribution is laid out. It's important to note that stormwater in the city of Moline is a lot different than in the village in terms of the layout and how the cost of handling stormwater. So it's hard to compare them. It's not necessarily an apples-to-apples basis. And with that, I'd be glad to take any questions. We've covered a lot of information.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the presentation, and those 37 slides, excuse me, actually cover quite a bit of ground, including things that we've addressed before, but this is a cumulative exercise, so we'll necessarily be talking about some of those issues. I think what you propose in terms of how a stormwater utility would work, there are a lot of different pieces. You can move around the board, you can play with that, tweak this, and whatnot, but for the most part, it's a pretty good approach in terms of trying to tailor it to the parcels and yet maintain equity and simplicity so that you're not burning up a lot of revenue in terms of managing the program. So that's good. To me, this really goes back, and this is the big question. It goes back to the policy issue, and of all the slides you showed, there's probably 3 that really matter. If we can go to 24, I actually got all the right numbers here. I think it bears repeating what you said earlier, is that looking at the utility or not looking at the utility does not change one concrete fact, and that is we have a gap.
Yep.
We have a gap between our revenues right now from available sources and what we're currently doing to try to maintain our stormwater system. We could stop this conversation about a stormwater utility right now. That slide doesn't go away. We have a gap, and we have to address it somehow. We're not even talking about the recommended level of service. That's what, and that's not a Cadillac level of service, folks. That's what we ought to be doing. That's sort of, the right way for our community, which just makes the gap get bigger. And so this slide is very important because it's why we're even having this conversation. There is a gap that needs to be filled. So we could do a number of things. We could, number one, do absolutely nothing, just not maintain our stormwater systems. That's an option. Actually, it's not, because then we'd be violating federal law, so I guess to some degree we can't even do that. Clean Water Act. But that would be an option, do nothing. Number 2 would be to pay for the gap through property taxes or sales taxes, or we could raise all kinds of things and close that gap. We could do that if that's what people want. Another one would be to address it through a stormwater utility, like what we're talking about and how that would work. And because this is something that's new and not been done as they say in these here parts, we're going through the details of how it would work. And I guess there's always another option, which is something else. And I'm all ears if there is a something else that hasn't been brought to our attention. But the question of whether you do, you close the, assuming we're going to close the gap, and we're not just going to do nothing and violate federal law. How do you close the gap? Do you do it with property taxes and raising other taxes? Or do you do it with the stormwater utility? Well, that then comes down to a comparison between, I think it's slide 11 and slide 26, which it's too bad they're not side by side because there's a very, very telling graphic there. And let's just make sure that I understand this correctly and I'm not misstating this, but if you look at slide 11.
Slide 11.
Yeah, start with 11.
They're going to look very similar because it's based on
There's
impervious.
a big difference.
Yep.
26 is the closer. 11 is the one to start off with. And the pie chart on the left is interesting, but for our conversation, completely irrelevant. The one on the right is the important one because we're talking about total impervious area. That's how much property is generating stormwater runoff. If you're not generating stormwater runoff, you're not a problem. Well, you still have to contribute a little bit because we have systems, but it's the impervious area. That percentage right there, about 46, what is that, 46.97%,
Yep.
say 47% of the impervious area in the Village of Downers Grove is residential. Okay, keep that in mind. Residential properties make up 47% of the impervious area. Okay, keep that in mind. Now let's go to 26. Bless you. Yet those same residential properties, if you look on the left side of this chart, this is slide 26, that pie chart, even though the residential properties only make up 47% of the impervious area in our village, they are currently paying 76% of the cost of maintaining our stormwater systems. That's the most telling two slides of this entire presentation. You want to talk about equity, why are the residential properties that only make up 46%, 47% of the total impervious area shouldering 76% of the cost? If we continue to go forward, how we've been paying for this in the past, property taxes, other kind of, well, mostly property taxes, that gap, that burden that the residential properties have been carrying is only going to increase. So we can keep going down the route of raising property taxes. That just means the residential properties are going to be carrying even more of the burden than they already are. It's already out of whack. And why is that important? Because we're talking about stormwater. It falls from the sky. We can't stop it. We're mandated by federal law to take care of certain parts of it no matter what. And it's kind of like the flip side of water. People pay for water based on their usage. You drink more water, you pay for more of it. You use less water, you pay for less of it. You have to have some kind of revenue to pay for at least the maintenance of the system to even have a water system. But after that, it's basically on a pay-as-you-go basis. Stormwater is kind of the opposite. You're not paying for water you use, you're paying to get rid of water that's running off of your property. And the more it runs off your property, the more you ought to pay. That seems to make perfect sense. But those two charts, 11 and 26, comparing it, just goes to show that the property tax system or way of paying for this doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It's not very equitable because you've got one group who's paying a lot more on a percentage-wise basis than another group. And increasing property taxes and other things to pay for this is only going to increase that inequity. But we could do that. I just want to point that out because I think that's very important. And then what was it, slide 29, I know you went through it just to show if you did this switch from property tax funding to stormwater utility funding, that there would be some change in the property tax burden for an individual property on average. And that would be because of this shift, this shift to spread it out more based on who's contributing to the runoff as opposed to right now it's the value of the property, and there's some people who aren't paying anything because they're tax exempt from property taxes. But other than that interesting little illustration, I hate that slide because the stormwater utility funding approach has absolutely nothing to do with the value of a property. So to say that, oh, a house that's worth $300,000 is going to pay X, that's comparing apples and oranges. Your house could be worth $1 million and have no impervious space, and you would be paying almost nothing. Or you could have a house that was worth $500 and you have a parking lot of all asphalt, and you're generating lots of impervious space. You're creating impervious area, and you're generating a lot of runoff. Although, for simplicity's sake, you've gone through the analysis to come up with, what are the parcels like based on their actual impervious area, and then trying to come up with this tiered approach, the ERUs. Because otherwise it gets to be, you're individually calculating every parcel in town, and then you're coming up with all these administrative costs that would end up eating into the whole purpose of doing this. So anyway, I want to make sure I'm getting that right, because that was the message that was just screaming off the screen to me in terms of the policy level discussion. But let me ask one question. You raised an interesting point about, let's say somebody who's in that first tier, that first ERU tier, does a remodel or an addition or something like that. How is it contemplated that we're going to monitor changes in terms of, obviously if somebody does some retention on site, they're going to be motivated to come to us and bring it to our attention in order to get the credit. I get that. There's a self-reporting mechanism there. But let's say somebody does an addition and now they've created more impervious space. Is that going to be through the building permit process? So we're going to know, and then we're going to put them in, if it puts them in a new tier?
Yes, absolutely. We already report that way. There'd be no change in administrative process. The GIS system from which this impervious area data comes from is already updated when building permits are taken out and work is complete.
So there wouldn't be any new monitoring. We wouldn't have to do a sweep every 5 years.
That's the beauty of our GIS system that's already in place.
All right. So whenever somebody comes in and they double their square footage in their impervious space, if it kicks them into another tier, they would automatically start paying that.
And of course, we would alert them to that when they applied for a building permit, so they would understand the potential impacts if we had this system.
Okay. The only other question I have, and this goes back to tweaking the details, but clearly I understand the concept of charging somebody a fee for applying to get the credit, but I think there's also something we're trying to encourage there, going back to our comprehensive plan in terms of sustainability and green, and so we got to think about how to balance that, because I wouldn't want to discourage anyone from doing something that would actually improve the system and help their neighbors and help our community. I get the administrative aspect to it, but I would want to think long and hard about making that a barrier, because that's actually behavior we want to encourage.
Yeah, I've seen some. You can tailor that program, obviously, where if it is a commercial property and if you have to verify the best management practices are in there and you have to look at engineering drawings and things like that, it could be a significant amount of staff time. And so ideally you'd structure that so that the fee would cover for those costs. There are utilities that have they waive the fee for residential properties that have rain barrels and things like that, although the discount or the credit is fairly minimal, because it really doesn't have a rain barrel. Does some volume control, but you really can't capture that much rainfall.
Right.
That's part of the issue.
Right.
Yeah, you can tailor that, and that's
well, just because
something you have to go through.
that's just behavior and trends that we'd like to encourage.
Sure.
The other question I had is just to make sure that it's reiterated. Somebody might ask me, wait a minute, let's say I put in a giant underground tank in my yard, not a rain barrel, I'm talking a giant tank that actually collects all my rainwater from my gutters, and I have zero discharge from my property, or close to zero discharge. Why should I have to pay a stormwater fee? And the reason why we're capping the credit, which is an awkward way of putting it, but limiting the amount of the credit and there being some amount of the fee, is because there's still a cost of maintaining the system generally, no different than the cost of maintaining roads and streets and things like that, which everybody has to kick in some amount to. It's like our water bills right now. If you shut your water off, not shut it off, but if you are a water subscriber and you don't use any water for a month, you're still going to get a bill, because there's a system-wide maintenance cost that everyone has to at least contribute, pay some minimal amount, and that's the concept we're talking about here in capping the credits.
Yep, exactly. I mean, there are utilities that offer 100% credit, but the vast majority, and our recommendation would be that you cap it, because there is a shared benefit. That person doesn't have flooding in the street in front of their house because you're handling the stormwater on the streets. Right. So everybody benefits from that.
Although, again, there's something that we could tweak if we thought from a community development standpoint there was a value to encouraging certain behavior, either commercial or residential. That's something you could play around with too.
Sure.
It actually creates a whole new bucket of incentives. That's an interesting thought. All right, I'm sorry, I've been monopolizing the time, so questions or comments, Commissioner Neustadt.
Thank you, Mayor. I agree with you about the credit application. That specific thing kind of jumped out at me that seems a little shaky that we'd be asking for cash back for someone trying to apply for a credit for something we're asking them to do. I guess that goes to my other two questions. Because we have the data already in our GIS system, would there be a lot of administrative burden if a residential property came in and said, hey, I've got 2 rain barrels and, say, a gravel driveway? Would we be able to tell that, not the rain barrels necessarily, but the gravel driveway component for a credit from our GIS system?
We're well positioned with the way we already operate and maintain our GIS system to gather just about every information about impervious already.
Okay, so if we were to do a parcel by parcel measurement of single family residence, I know that does take some administrative time to do it, but can the GIS system handle that as well, or does it have to be a physical site?
No, in fact, the information you saw that
Yeah, we have
here
that
tonight-
information. I can tell you every single parcel's actual down to the square footage, how much impervious they have, so we know it for everybody.
But how about pervious also?
Yes,
Do both?
we know both.
So you could do a pervious plus pervious measurement?
Yes.
Okay, and then I'm kind of focusing on the measurements here, but for the other parcels, the commercial, industrial, churches, schools and such, would those be measured with the impervious and the pervious, or just the impervious?
Just the impervious.
Okay,
Yep.
so that goes to the credit question, and we just kind of raised it at the end of Mayor Tully's comments about, as a village, when we say we have a PUD, we suggest, or actually say that you have to have detention, you have to have restricted flow out of your site, you have to have all these things that we tell you to do. It seems to me that to only give a 50% credit for something that we're mandating or legislating, for me, one guy would say that we might want to consider a bigger credit for some of the larger properties that we've asked to maintain, store, and control their own water until they can get into the system. That's kind of the whole goal of the restricted access and things. So that's just another comment that I'll have to think about, but I want folks to think about that.
Yeah, you could actually work that into your, into the PUD in some way if you wanted to.
Exactly. So, I think that's all the questions I had, just those couple of measurement deals. I think the tiered approach is probably a sensible one, but I know that there's parcels in town, and the manager and I have talked about this, where there's, side yards, there's all sorts of different ways where one property owner with 2 PIN numbers can actually have less runoff than, say, their neighbor. So I don't want to get too bogged down with, everybody lining up out the door here saying, well, I should get 5% off or 10% off because of my tiered value is 1. I think I should be at 0.75. So
I just want to make something clear. We used the word parcel throughout the presentation tonight. That was just a labeling. The square footage we're talking about is the actual measured impervious area. So that issue in your example is already taken into consideration the way MFSG has put this system, for example, together.
Okay.
So that's already considered.
great. That's all I have for tonight, Mayor. Thank you. Thank you for another great presentation.
Thank you.
And for getting us the presentation so we can kind of
You're
watch it
welcome.
here and there and listen all at the same time.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Commissioner Schnell?
A couple of things. One, the policy decision that we ultimately have to make, really, from my perspective, is whether or not we continue to put the burden on a segment of the population of Downsgrove that actually uses the stormwater, or whether or not it becomes a user-type fee similar to water, similar to garbage, similar to other things, where people actually pay for their part of the responsibility of the system. And in this case, I think what the slides have shown us is that all municipalities that actually have stormwater utilities have put the burden across all segments, so there are really no exemptions. You either have it or you don't have it, but the exemptions really don't exist. I think that's a very important thing that we're going to have to look at from a policy point of view, because we either do it and don't have exemptions, or we just don't do it. Because once you start opening the crack, the water will flow, and literally and figuratively. So I think we need to be very careful, and as we deliberate this from a policy point of view, from my perspective, that's one of the things that we really have to, I guess, decide first, and then decide whether utility makes any sense. The other thing that I think we also have to decide from a policy point of view is, every time you say, well, maybe we could, you know, with the PUD, and I agree, there are certain PUDs in our community that, you know, they've gone up, they have lots of green space. The problem is, once you start doing more credits, then the cost gets spread more on other people. There's a fixed cost to all of this, depending on which one of the three you choose, but there is a fixed cost. So if you start doing credits, then all of a sudden that cost becomes more of a burden to another segment. And again, this is a policy decision that ultimately we will have to make, but I think we have to keep that in mind, that you know, giving credit to one segment is going to put the burden on another segment. And I think if we make the credit system too burdensome or too cumbersome, all of a sudden everybody in the community is going to be asking for something. I mean, I have a rain barrel, I have my gutters going underground, I want a credit, you know, and it means 42 cents. But, and that's being facetious, obviously, but I think we just need to be careful that the policy decision that we ultimately make about credits is kind of fair to everybody. And I think that's what your presentation is showing us, is that 50 seems to be the break even. And I don't disagree that we shouldn't talk about it. I think we just need to be cognizant of the fact
No,
that
I think you're right, because the concept isn't that, you know, somebody's going to game the system.
Right.
I think that the question is, we don't want to punish somebody and make them pay twice. So, for example, if we required them to spend $1 million to put in this elaborate detention system, and then they got to pay on top of it, that might not be fair. I think, to your point, there ought to be, everybody ought to shoulder the burden.
Right.
But there may be both residential and commercial properties where they pay, but in a different way. And I'm not going to sit here and try to pretend I know every situation that would arise that would make sense, but we can imagine some where it would.
Well, and I think credits are fine. I think we just need to be careful how big a credit we allow.
Agreed.
And ultimately, that's a decision that the seven of us, if we decide to go with stormwater utility, will have to make. I do have a question, because I actually asked the village manager this, so my assumption is there would be other people who were doing this too. Under the fee structure with the single-family residential, you have the small parcel, medium parcel, and large parcel. When you say 1 to 2,500 square foot of impervious and 2,501, you're not talking the square footage of a house.
No.
You are,
Total impervious.
You're talking about driveways and sheds.
Sidewalks and roofs and
all those wonderful things. So if someone's, you know, sitting out there going, well, my house is only 1,600 square feet, that's not what you're talking about.
No.
So
It's actual measurement on the parcel of sidewalks, driveways, roof, shed, anything that would be impervious.
okay.
Yep.
Okay, and I think that's an important
So
point to make.
most households are going to have a greater impervious than the square footage of their household.
And not public sidewalks, those are in the right of way.
Correct.
Service walks, service walks would be, in our language, what he's talking about.
We're not going to charge them for putting
Right.
sidewalks on there. Okay. No, again, I appreciate having had this earlier, because it really was good to go over a couple of times at home. So, and great presentation. Yeah.
Thank you.
Good job. I mean, ultimately, I think for the residents that are out there, when we have, after the fourth presentation, we're going to have, I think, many discussions up here. Plus, there will be an educational component, which I think I've said a million times, but there will be an educational component where this kind of, not dog and pony show, but an explanation of what we're talking about will be brought to the residents.
That's correct. Just a good time to mention this process. In the third meeting in October, we'll hear some recommendations from MFSG. The council may take a couple of weeks to think that over. And then we're not asking for a yes per se at that point. A yes would mean the council's directing staff to further look into it. If that's the case, it would launch probably a 90-day period of public outreach meetings with key stakeholders, allow us to get their feedback, and then come back to the council and start diving in to some of the details. However, in October, November of this year, if you've decided that this is something that we should not pursue, then we could stop the process around that time.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Questions or comments, Commissioner Burnett?
Thank you, Mayor. It's pretty important to underscore, I think, what Marilyn said is in particular. That number, whatever it is, $6 million, it's the recommended level, is the number that we believe something approximate to that is what we need to maintain adequately our existing system. And not unlike what we saw with water a year ago, we're not doing it now. But the other thing that's important is that number is Marilyn said it, it's a number we're going to levy, so it's going to come from somewhere. So these offsetting credits or exemptions or whatever just shift the burden. But it also is never going down. That's not a number that's going to get, you know, some sort of, it's unlikely to get some sort of Springfield adjustment to the amortization period. That number is going to go up next year, and the next year, and the next year.
You underestimate Springfield.
Yeah, probably so. But that's I think it's important that everybody sort of digest that. What that means is whether that's coming from property taxes as it's been, frankly, for a number of years, or whether it comes out of stormwater utility, it's a number that is going to continue to increase regardless of what we do. So we can have one village employee or 400, we can have this program or that. That burden is on us as a village to deal with. And so it's why we start every time talking about what is the most equitable way to try and split that up. Because it's here, it's going to stay, and it's going to grow. Those are things I think we know are going to happen. The thing that I think is in particular about this slide, and that one, number 29 as well, that's, I know the mayor hates them, and he's right, because it doesn't have anything to do with property values, but the big thing is that difference between that 640 number and that 1440 number. That's why we've got, in the analogy, that's why we've got 4 years or 5 years or whatever it is of 14% water increases staring us in the face, because we got the exact same thing and we're trying to handle it. And so these numbers are huge, scary, awkward, unsettling probably, but really important and necessary. And we're playing catch up. That's reality. We'll talk, as Marilyn said, lots and lots of times probably over the next 6 months on this thing if we go forward at all. But while I believe that this is an appropriate thing to do, and I think it's a logical approach, in my mind, it mimics very much garbage, it mimics very much water, the understanding that there's a base cost and it needs to be equitably shared by everybody. I still have a problem with the idea that we're going to do some of it with property tax and some of it not. I think that we ought to be doing this, but I also think we ought to be having an offsetting property tax change. What that means for us really is, in light of some of the LRFP meetings and things, that this isn't necessarily a new revenue source. This is a required revenue source for existing services. And that's a pretty big distinction that we're going to all have to sort out up here over the next several months. So, thanks.
Mr. Waldeck.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the presentation. We've been at Stormwater Utility for, what, a decade?
Just about.
We know that we have costs associated with when the rain comes down, and the idea is everybody says, how are you going to pay for it? And way back when it was, you know, do we put it on the property taxes? And I appreciate the slides that basically says the residential folks are taking a hit. If you put it on the property taxes, you can deduct it on your from your other taxes, your federal taxes. However, is that enough to justify going, you know, keeping it on property taxes and not a fee? And I don't think so. I think you know, the slides pretty much show that in order to be equitable, it doesn't look like it's fair to do the property tax thing. I was going through, and I appreciate the mayor starting the conversation with the slides. But I was going through way up in your first slide. You were talking about the choices: impervious plus pervious, and total area. And it got me wondering, what's the difference between total area and impervious plus pervious? I mean, if you had them both together, you're 100%, right?
Yeah, it's
Quasi-pervious.
It's a level of complexity. If you do, some people do impervious area plus a different factor for pervious area. So they'll say if your lot's 75% pervious and 25% impervious, then you pay 1 ERU for the impervious part, and you pay a fraction of an ERU for the pervious part. Because the reality is that when you have a rain event, your grass doesn't absorb all the water. You still do get some runoff. So that's the I think the city of Moline actually does that. But that's a step beyond impervious area only, which would add a level of complexity that most people don't want to.
Say that's
don't wanna
sounds
go.
more like administrative
Yes.
nightmare, which is another problem I had with, and I think that technology has changed. The village manager is almost convincing me that we do have all this all set, and we don't have to send out troops 2 by 2 to visit everybody's backyard to see what they got. I'm a little concerned about starting the rain barrel police, though. I have a rain barrel. No, you don't. Yes, I do. It's connected. No, it isn't. Yes, it is.
That's not a rain barrel, it's a Dixie cup.
There you go. As a matter of fact, before we came out, I was asking about a deck. Is a deck pervious or impervious? I say, well, it's pervious, but your slats are only, every few inches, and then the rain, whatever, drops down into what's definitely pervious. So it's almost like you should get a credit for a deck rather than the other way around. That could be argued. I mean, these are all things that need to be administratively addressed. Also, when it rains an inch in the north side of Downers Grove, it rains an inch on the south side of Downers Grove. And got me wondering about a watch meeting that was held years and years ago when somebody was talking about, when they had somebody from the county talking about stormwater, and they talked about the quality of our ground. It's clay. And I'm wondering how pervious we really are. So I got some grass growing. It's considered pervious, but it's only going down an inch or so before it runs off into the system anyway. So does it really matter based on the quality of our soil? Just a question. I don't know. Does it really matter? Is there that much a difference?
I think the argument would be that the current structure of assessed value has no base whatsoever in terms of the potential impact, whereas as you move towards impervious, it's not perfect. I would absolutely agree with that, depending on the slope of your property, and we can't measure it through a water meter, but it's much more equitable and realistic than the value of my property. That really has nothing to do with with how much stormwater I'm going to contribute. So it's moving in the right direction. Maybe as technology gets better, we'll be able to actually determine how much runoff's actually coming off, but it's moving in that direction, so that's the argument for it.
Next thing we'll have to do with the GIS is determine slope too.
That's right.
Huh?
Eventually, we'll be able to
Goodness
determine exactly
gracious.
what house the runoff came from. There goes Waldback's runoff.
Everybody will have a different color, different chemical makeup or something.
Reminds me of that book, 1984.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking years ago. Let's see.
Thinking that now.
And I think to Commissioner Schnell's point, we are talking about, for example, business doing attraction and retention of business. It's important, that the thought is, when we try and bring business in, that they want exemptions from various things, and there has to be equity, and that if we give somebody an exemption, somebody else has to pick up the tab. Somebody's paying the tab for that. And, as the Commissioner said, we should have that conversation and determine that there should be absolutely no exemptions for that type of thing.
If I could follow there, I think there's a real important point there. If you do over time, if you do have people mitigating stormwater, eventually it does reduce costs. I mean, we do say, if you give a credit, somebody else is paying. Initially, that's true, but over time, as you handle your stormwater, more and more green roofs go in, more and more retention ponds, things of that sort go in. People change the way they develop. They put in pervious pavement in. That does reduce the volume of flow that goes through the system, that ultimately reduces the stream stabilization that you have to do and things of that sort. So it's long-term, but it's not completely a zero-sum game in that sense.
Well, for that really to succeed, it would have to be a regional solution.
That's true.
Otherwise, we'd just be the big sponge for Darien and
That's true.
Westmont and Woodridge.
Well, that's the credit conversation. I was just thinking of the business conversation. In other words, when I decided to move from Palatine to Downers
Yeah.
Grove, nobody said, we're going to give you a tax cut if you move to Downers
Right.
Grove because you're Bill, we want you to live here. However, we do that for business. You know, we say, okay, we'll mitigate some fees and we'll do some of this. Okay, if you want to put in a stormwater situation, we can give you credits.
Yeah.
But, you know, just because you're,
We'll have designer credits for you, Bill.
there we go. But, it's important that this be done, all done fair and square, so. There's a lot of information here, and we'll just continue to look at it. Thank you.
Commissioner Rankin?
I just have a few questions. If we decided as a group to create a stormwater utility, what kind of staffing would we need to add? Is it, 10 people, 20 people?
I
Just
think
curious.
if the council tells us to continue to pursue this, and then we go in that 90-day period, that's when we would address things like actual billing methodology, staffing impacts, that we could come back to you with a full picture of how it would affect not only...
You don't even want to spend the time and resources looking into that until you have some policy.
Right. I can say this, though. We are very well positioned for the administration of a system like this because of the technology we currently have in place and the staffing we currently have in place. So we'll get into that later if we are directed to do so.
Okay, and I agree with some of the other people on the dais about the credit application fee. I think that's just kind of hindering people from trying to do what we want them to do. And then one of the things that you said in this presentation and the last presentation that I thought was interesting is that we're on a 220-year replacement plan right now, and that's unacceptable. So we've got to figure out some sort of solution. Thanks.
Town's not even that old. Commissioner Durkin?
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. I just have a couple things. And these were questions that were actually addressed to me and I wasn't able to answer, and maybe it's preliminary to get to it. But there are some homes that do not have sump pumps. What kind of impact would that have? If you don't have a sump pump, is there a credit for that? No credit? Does the GIS pick that up? Does it know that? Some residents have, because of the lots that they bought, have dry basins, stormwater retention, right? Yeah, retention on their properties where 99% of the time it's dry. How does that impact? I mean, is that do they get a credit for that, or, I mean, these are just questions. And then last, as dumb as it sounds, so we're talking about decks and spacing. What happens if you have rock in your landscaping instead of mulch? Is that a penalty?
No, I mean, that would be a level of detail that the GIS does
The rock
not,
was always there?
the GIS would not pick up that that's
Prove that.
impervious.
How far back are we going? All right, and then in regards to what Commissioner Barnett had mentioned, I would be in favor of discussing this further as long as we're going to look at doing a credit back to the property tax bill.
One last comment. since I'm jumping
And that's all I
around.
have.
No, then we're going to hear from the audience.
Here's an example for you that I'll give you that maybe we could get some information on what we would do with this particular parcel. It's an ongoing project over at North High. They just redid their fields. They've got a new synthetic turf field, parking lot, in-ground detention that they're going to end up using for gray water for watering ball fields. So that's going to be a lot of water stored, reused. I mean, it's just an example that in my mind might help me figure how we're going to calculate credits. I think you're right, Marilyn, about the exemptions. I'm not looking for exemptions, but I think that credits for a system like that is really advanced and far beyond what a regular kind of detention might be is something that we have to give special attention to.
Yep.
Because it's exactly what we would want them to be doing with their property right now.
Yep.
So just an example, maybe something to consider.
Yeah, unfortunately, there are, other utilities around the country as well as in the state of Illinois that have, very detailed credit manuals and very not detailed credit manuals. Obviously, the more detailed, the more administrative burden. But I did want to mention the idea that the reason that most people set 30% at water volume control is because there are engineering analysis that say that you can only, during a certain rain event, a 2-inch storm, you can only size something that would retain that amount of volume. So it's not completely arbitrary. There are hydraulic analysis that say, most people design it for the 1-inch storm event. Yes, you can contain that, but once it's beyond that, so there's some rationales for why you would set those levels of what you do. And if you do some search on the internet, there's a huge range of credit programs. Some that are it's not just credits. Some offer grants and incentives so that they would actually fund somebody to put in a green roof out of the stormwater utility. And there's a whole host once you move down this path of good things that you can do. But you just have to be willing to handle the administrative issues of it. We did factor in our financial modeling. We did assume some increased staff time. We assumed basically that you'd need about 1/2 person for a GIS at about, I think that we figured about $36,000 a year that you would need a GIS person, spend about half time looking at this, maintaining it. And then initially, as you set up the program, there would be some initial costs that would eventually go away. Once this is established, we did some research and asked those utilities in the state of Illinois that have a tiered versus an average ERU approach if they see more administrative burden, and they all said that they don't. That they don't have people coming in and say, hey, I want to go down to the smaller ERU. I really, I'm right on that line, and they just don't experience that. So initially there will be some administrative issues, but if you talk to the vast majority, once you get it up and running, it's pretty minimal in terms of the effort, because it is impervious is a static thing, and once you establish that, get the credits program going, it's really not a huge administrative burden.
Any other questions or comments from the council? Any questions or comments on the latest installment of our exploration of a proposed stormwater utility